So I've been giving a lot of thought to what I was talking about during my earlier video in this season. When I was talking about creating the labyrinth map and the differences between it and the mega dungeons, one of the things that I came up against was the fact that I get frustrated making grid maps, because generally speaking, I like to work in very large dungeons. And of course, that's not something you can do when you're working with a grid map because of the time that it takes and the detail that's required. So I thought, you know what? Why not try something a little bit more ambitious? Why not try to create my own modular grid map, something that I can digitally render, upload, and then use to create extensive grid maps in the same style, much, much larger than I would ever be able to create on paper. So before we get into that, let's set the stage. We've escaped from the dark castle. All around us is the crumbling, cracking, roaring elemental plane of Earth. There's no light. There's no water. Not even the faintest shifting of a breeze in this dark place. And from here and to our destination, we must wander through the winding, craggy paths created by the slipping tectonic plates of this archaic elemental zone. The elemental plane of Earth is, I think, a great place to experiment with this particular concept, because it's a plane in which everything is filled with stone and rock and earth. The only places that a mortal can move through are the cracks between the enormous plates as they grind against each other. They're constantly shifting, constantly moving. It's its own reality-sized mega dungeon. No map would ever be large enough to contain this concept, and so it's the best place to start. So in this episode, what I'm going to do is I'm going to detail my effort to create a modular map, the steps that I've taken, the concepts that I've had to keep in mind, and in the end, we'll see how well it works as I upload it and digitally render it so that we can see whether or not this concept is something that I'll do more often and whether you can bring it to your own worlds. I'm also privileged in this season to be operating along with Isaac from Conflux Creatures, who's created some stat blocks that I'm specifically pairing my maps with. So in earlier episodes, when I created the labyrinth map or the castle map, I've paired those with the ratfolk and the Dao. And in this case, on the elemental plane of Earth, in this constantly shifting maze, I am excited to be working with Conflux Creatures stat blocks for the Earth elementals and all of the different variations of them therein. So why don't we get straight into it and we'll see how we go from there. I'm going to start with a blank A2 sheet of paper. Throughout the series, I've said that I'm working with a blank A2 because I prefer it as a material for painting on, and for a variety of other reasons. But in this case, I would actually recommend starting with a blank A2. You can create the grid on your own, and it's going to be much easier to digitally render it if you've got blank space around the individual tiles. So what we're going to do to begin with is I'm going to go through and create the grid first, and then I'm going to decide how many tiles that I want. In this case, it's going to be 24. 24 individual tiles, which I'm going to split into several categories. Because of the way that the elemental plane of Earth is laid out, I need to consider only really two variations of the tiles themselves. All I need is passages on the one side, the paths between the rock, and the caverns on the other. So the grid is painstaking to set up, yes. But once you've done that and you have a fair idea of the amount of space that you're working with and you can erase it later, it's an invaluable tool. So I would recommend taking the time to do it yourself with a soft pencil that won't show up on the later scans. And once you've finished the grid, which I will in a moment, you're going to have to start thinking about, for your own style and for the purpose of the maps that you're going to be creating, what tiles you want to use. So in this case, as I mentioned before, I have 24 different kinds of terrain tiles that I'm going to create here. The process is going to be very simple, and I'll go through that step by step on the screen. But overall, on the left-hand side, I'm going to have all of the different passages. And for that kind, I'm going to need at least 6 basic concepts. I'm going to need a straight path. I'm going to have a straight path, which is around 5 foot wide throughout. I'm going to have a straight to wide, which goes from 5 feet to 10 feet wide, a straight to narrow, which goes from 5 feet to 2 feet for difficult terrain. I want corners, I want T-junctions, and I want split paths. I'm also going to create a couple of chambers in the middle of the path so I can pepper in very small, cramped encounters, and I want variations on them as well. I want cracked floors and crystals off the sides, which I can use to create not only difficult terrain, but also three-dimensionality if they fall through the cracks. The crystals will allow for light as well. It's the only light source within the elemental plane of Earth, so it allows me to do a bit more ambience. And then on that side as well, down the bottom, I'm going to add in a few bits and pieces, some rocks and pillars that I can use to make the terrain look a little bit more random than the tiles themselves. And when I work on the caverns on the right-hand side, I'm going to have, of course, every variation of corner I could want to poke a stick at. I'm going to have cracked corners, pocket corners, crystal corners, crevice corners. I'm going to have a couple of different kinds of walls, a wall with cracks and a wall with crystals, different kinds of entryway according to width and according to what the terrain looks like, and a few different kinds of floor as well. So I've got variation there too. And overall, the more I worked on it, the more I realized that 24 tiles would honestly not really be enough. I'm going to see how I work with them, and I can add more later on. But just for the sense of perfectionism that I like to bring to my own maps, I need a bit more space to work with. So as you can see now, I'm going through and I'm going to watercolor the chambers. I like working with watercolors. I think it adds a little bit of depth and a bit of sort of randomness of style and aesthetic that I think really lends itself to a modular concept like this. So I'm going to make the borders in a light brown, and I'm going to darken it out as we go out further so that when I render them digitally, I can fade that black out. I can make it more transparent towards the edges so that when I create the map on a black background, they just fade straight into the background. But you can see a few of the ideas that I'm working with here now. That split passage, the curves, the edges, the crossroads that I'm kind of working with in order to get this off the ground. And honestly, this part of the map didn't take me very long at all. Once you've got the grid and you've got the idea of what you want to create, moving forward to actually painting it doesn't take very much time at all. I'm going to go through and detail it later. I'm going to ink it, and then the real time-consuming part is going to be digitally rendering it. So let's circle on back. I wanted to talk about why I wanted to try this concept rather than just making an extremely large map. If you've been watching the series so far, you may have noticed that I've been moving up in scale with each iteration of the map I've been working on. I started with 1 inch square being 5 by 5 feet. And then in the following map, 1 centimeter square was 5 by 5 feet. 2 maps later, 1 centimeter square was 15 by 15 feet. It's only logical for me to keep going up and up and up, but there is an upper limit on how large I can create a map. And the problem with, of course, the 15 by 15 is that at that size, I couldn't add the detail that would mean that I could use them on any kind of normal scale. I wouldn't be able to digitally render it and then stick my players in those squares and say, all right, this is all the detail you need. So there is an upper limit problem there. I mean, the benefit with singular maps is, of course, that you can create them for specific environments. You can add in some lore. You can have specific challenges for that situation. And you can change the maps to address new information as you're preparing for encounters. You can also use the design time as you're making that map, as you're drawing it out, to think about the story and start tying in those storytelling elements. But a modular map would allow me to start thinking about creating a uniformity of maps across an entire biome. In this case, the elemental plane of Earth. If I create these tiles and I use them over and over again, then I should be able to make every map very quickly and easily in exactly the same style so that you can just join them all together. So it's quicker and easier in that concept as well, once you get past the original idea of actually drawing them out. And maybe if this goes well, it's not just this 1 sheet of modular tiles that I create, but maybe 2 or even 3, so that I've got a fair amount of differentiation so that I can make something that looks very randomized. And I think that the concept that I've got on the left-hand side at the bottom of those scattered rocks and pillars will allow me to make it look sufficiently random. And I think even a few more variations on that concept, different kinds of furniture, if you will, scatter terrain, will allow me to create a map that looks like it's been drawn or painted every single time. So in that way, you can make much larger digital maps that I would never be able to create in person because the size of paper doesn't necessarily exist. If I've got to work on a 1-inch square for 5 feet, which is the standard size for the minis that we use for Dungeons and Dragons, then I'm never going to be able to fit a mega dungeon on a piece of paper. They don't make paper in that size. So digitally is the only way I'm going to be able to do that. And this is the method I'm going to have to use if I want to use it. And theoretically, I could use digital painting tools, and there are a bunch of different tools online. I just wanted to do this to challenge myself and see how it would work. I know that there are other solutions out there, but honestly, I don't understand them. I work much better with my hands than I do on a computer. And so this is the best option, I think, for creating that labyrinthine setting, that new concept that I want to explore, the constantly changing setting that you can return to again and again and have it always be different. And you can start seeing here the variations that I've started setting up, the cracks in the walls, the crystals scattered around, so that they look really cool and interesting and explorable on that single 5x5 tile. If you blow that up, it'll look a little simple, perhaps, but it will still give your players something to grasp onto, and different terrains, different styles of cover, different challenges and difficult terrains that you can weave into the combat experience and exploration. So I've added in those variations now, and I'm going to go in and start doing the outlines. I'm going to use a fine liner pen over the watercolor. You've got to let it dry first, of course, and do a single outline to begin with. And then once I've finished that, I'm going to use a thinner fine liner. This is a 0.4. I'm going to go in with a 0.1, maybe even a 0.05 millimeter, and do a few imperfections in the outline. So a few cracks that go into the wall to make it a little bit more visually interesting, and then add a few scattered rocks using the fine liner on the ground below. Because that element of randomness, of randomosity, is going to make it much more visually interesting. And I will address that later as well when I draw in the grid within the passages and the caverns by hand rather than using a ruler. Because it's much more interesting to look at, yes, but also because creating something that has a bit of randomness in it will give the impression that the world has more detail than you're actually able to put into it. So a grid on the ground that wibbles a little bit and has a few imperfections implies that the ground itself is uneven. A perfect grid implies perfection, and I don't want to imply that on this particular map. So I think it's about time for us to once again give thanks to our friends at Conflux Creatures, and talk about the stat blocks that we're bringing in for this particular setting, which is the stat blocks of the earth elementals that they've created. And there are quite a few of them, and I'm really keen to start bringing them into my own campaign because I think that the elementals are a concept that haven't been explored enough in terms of variation. They're a whole plane of creatures all working on the same idea, that lack of elemental variation that makes us so unique on the material plane, because we have air and earth and water and fire within us, and that makes us really variable and also really soft in a lot of ways. But they are all working on the same basic material. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they are all the same, and I love seeing the variations that we've got here, because Conflux has a group of earth elementals of varying challenge ratings that I think you can really work into your concepts. Everything from the sling rock blocklets, which are really small elementals that won't provide too much of a challenge, but do allow for a lot of role-playing capability, up to the standard earth elementals, which are much more of a challenge, and even up to the very top, where you get creatures like the Rubblehulk, and everything in between, all the different variations, and they all have this sort of earth power inspired ability, this connection to the earth, this amazing toughness that makes them a real combat and roleplay challenge, but allows you as a DM to bring in a lot of variation and richness to the world that I just adore. So it's just a fantastic opportunity to keep exploring a different kind of universe and a different concept. So now we've talked about the concepts behind the grid maps, the method of making them, the inhabitants in terms of the earth elementals. We're starting to really come together with those concepts, those basics. And so in a moment, when I finish doing the grid, we're going to go through, I'm going to show how I rendered them really, really quickly, not with all of the tiles, I'm just going to show an example of them, and then how I can kind of stick them together, and we'll talk about how that works out. But before we do, I want to talk about how you can tie this kind of thing into the quest. So I talked a little bit about how the Earth Elemental Plane earlier on can be used to create this kind of map, but we've been tying these concepts into each grid map as we've gone along to illustrate how you can create a map that ties directly into the story rather than just being a prop along the way. And this one's no different, because so far along the quest, our heroes have started in a standard tavern interior, they've gone down into the sewer tunnels, they went into dungeons, and then they went to a castle, all of which are really kind of normal places for Dungeons and Dragons and ttrpgs to go. And in this case, I think this one is the far out kind of idea. The elemental plane of Earth, any of the elemental planes, really provide a lot of a challenge for storytelling because they're just so different and hostile to your players that it means that they can really struggle, I think, to explore that. So in this case, they began at Castle Coruna, which was a fortress of the Dao, and they want to make their way to the lair of the Ogremok, which has promised them an escape from the elemental plane of Earth. And from that point A to point B, before they can confront the Ogremok, before they can claim the jewel, they have to make their way through the winding cracks and tunnels and passageways of this unending expanse of dirt and rock, which is extremely dark. There's no airflow, there's no warmth or cold, it's just Earth. So there's no maps of the elemental plane of Earth because there's no point. The Earth itself is constantly shifting and cracking. So they've just got to use their wits to keep themselves going in the same direction. And they'll encounter the inhabitants of the Earth plane along the way, and they're more likely to be hostile than not because the players are going to be so different, so strange and unique that they're going to want to defend themselves from these interlopers. But there is the possibility that if they encounter an Earth elemental and they either negotiate with it or they force it to help them, that elemental can help guide them through the tunnels. And it allows for you as a DM as well, this particular setting, to force your players into a situation in which they have to think about their survival and not just about combat. Levels of exhaustion, the inability to take long rests, difficulty encountering supplies or materials, and certainly for replacements of any weapons. You're going to have a great time in forcing them to think about how they're going to set things up and become more strategic. And of course, talk to your players about doing that beforehand. I'll just spring it on them. But variation in gaming is what fun is all about. So this provides the opportunity to do that. So I've drawn in the grid now. We're going to go into the last step, which is creating the rendering. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scan this. I'm going to make it look nice digitally. I'm going to put it all into one page. And then one by one, I'm going to cut the tiles out. I'm going to erase around the outside and save them as different files. I'm sure there's a better way to do this. If you know of a better way, let me know in the comments, because this is actually taking much longer than I thought it was. What I'm doing is I'm going to bring the different tiles in as different layers. And as I'm doing it, it's just taking a really long time. It's really exhausting. And I think it looks all right, honestly. It's just the amount of time that it takes. I want it to be much more accessible than this. So here's an example of what it can look like. It's all right. I mean, I wanted to make a really big example of it, but even this, scanning it and rendering it, and I will put the examples of the tiles in the description below so you can check them out. You can download everything, you have a look at it and see how you can create your own. But bringing them all in, rendering them took a really, really long time. So I didn't have as much time to make a really huge map as I would like to. When I've got a bit more time on my hands, I might try it again. Overall, though, I'm not certain about this. So there you have it. We've created our modular tiles. We've made a new world to explore the idea that you can make a map that encompasses an open world that you can create as you go, rather than a static map, is something that I was really excited about. I thought that it would be a great idea, but in the end did not turn out the way that I would like. I might come back to the concept and see if I can try to perfect it, but I'm going to put this down as good intentions, not so great execution. Let me know what you think in the comments. Next week, we're going to be delving into making layers for mega creatures. So I wanted to make a map that was not only enormous, but it also had a creature within it. In this case, Conflux Creatures, stat block for the Ogremok, which is a beast large enough to appear as part of the map. So I wanted to be able to climb on it and work it into the map in that way. So we'll see how I work out that next week. In the meantime, thank you for watching. I hope that you found this very useful. If you did, I have a bunch of other videos. I've been creating grid maps for the last few weeks. You can always stick a comment below if you want to ask specific questions or if you have any thoughts about the video. But I've also started a Discord to share map making efforts and concepts as we make them. So if you wanted a supportive community, if you wanted new ideas, you can check that out. All of the downloadables and links to the videos can be found on my Patreon, which is free to join. And if you do want to support me and help me to buy more mapping supplies, that would be very appreciated. I have Patreon and YouTube members. YouTube members get early access to the videos. Patreons get extra downloads. It's entirely up to you which one you choose. But until next week, happy mapping, and I'll see you then.